Community College family. Thank you for being on the call today. During this session, we asked Mr. Gene Ritter, well, actually, he has some information he wanted to partake to us. So he wanted to have a session with the current changes to RDS. We want to thank him for being on the call today. I will say before we get started, if you need to take a call, please put your computer on mute. If you're on the phone and you need to hang up or talk to someone, do not put it on hold because we do not want to hear your music. If you have any questions during this meeting, please put it in the chat box or just say excuse me and we can take your question as we go along so you won't forget about it, or if you feel more comfortable at the end. So it's pretty much open to how you want to provide this. What we'll do is we will read the questions also as we go along from the chat box. So if you have a question in the chat box, I will continuously review that and see if Mr. Ritter can answer our questions. So most of you already know Gene Ritter. He works for State Education Assistance Authority, and he has been with us for a long time. He is the expert in RDS. He is the person who actually updates a lot of those guides that you're going to be getting on your campus about RDS, and he is the one who actually we referred to during our meeting at HECAC, which is the governing body for RDS for the institutions. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Gene Ritter.
Thanks, Monty. Hello, everyone. So we were going to do just a basic update on only the changes, but we had some requests that some campuses have had a change in staff and have new staff, and a lot of this is new to them. So we're also going to combine and do a combination of a quick overview of what is RDS about, the basic requirements, and then I'm going to get into changes and things specific to community colleges. There's another presentation coming up next week, and it's going to be going over the campus responsibility guide, and that one is more for the folks in your campus that are handling the who certifies the campus-based exceptions, what students need to get tracked, and how to take care of that, those kinds of not typical everyday questions, okay? So I'll say a little bit about it in this presentation, but we're going to do a little bit of a combination of the two, and then the next presentation is going to go into that new campus guide specifically. So what we talked about is basically some of the basic requirements. I'm going to tell you all what we see from the residency side in terms of common issues or suggestions that we could avoid. The options, we have students who get a non-resident determination, and then the recent changes. In addition to taking burning questions we go through, we have a lot of time devoted at the end. So I want to take whatever questions you have or feedback or suggestions and see if we can talk through together. So I think most of you know, or if you're new to this state, the idea here is that North Carolina law, like most states, have a differential in tuition that the folks who are in-state residents get a subsidized rate. And it's fairly consistent between states. In some ways, North Carolina is a little more stringent. That what happened is in 2013, the legislature directed that one centralized service make these determinations. A variety of reasons, led to that, including some folks in the legislature said that they had, a son or daughter apply to several campuses, and the experience was very different. Some of them asked 2 questions. Some of them they had to give a whole packet of documents, and sometimes they get in, sometimes they got out, but that was kind of the history of it. The residency law per se, other than minor little changes and mostly for campus-based exceptions, hasn't changed all that much. It dates back to the 1970s. So some people think it's all brand new. It's really, a lot of it is not. Most of these changes have to do with exceptions rather than the general residency law. You're going to hear RDS, CFI, CFNC, SCAA. So to try to explain it briefly who all the players are, RDS is the program that was created. It's managed by College Foundation. It's part of a collaboration of CFNC to help students prepare for and fund and get admitted to college. The residency program per se falls under the guidance of SCAA that I'm currently working for. I previously worked at CFI with the RDS prior to going live and helping to launch that program. So it's SCAA that has the statutory authority and the one that creates the guidebook and decides policy and so forth. So that's a little bit about us. And SCEA is really a entity under the umbrella of UNC. But I wear two hats, by the way. I did come this way through the community college system. Actually, I still work as an adjunct instructor at a community college, so I have dual citizenship. So some of the basics. North Carolina law says there's a lot of exceptions, and we'll talk about them, but the basic law says the person has to be domiciled here at least 12 months and provide evidence. So basically what RDS tries to do is, if you have a student where it looks like they've always been here, there's nothing pointing to another state, you know, they're looking for a couple of things just to confirm that. When you have evidence of another state, this is not your typical student, but UNC's got a lot of students who want to claim they've been living here to try to get that admission and that in-state tuition for the residential campus. Huge issue. If there's another state, RDS is going to dig deeper. If not, no. But the other thing is, being present for 12 months is not the same as it's a permanent residence. For example, we'll talk about there's exceptions for active duty military stationed in North Carolina. If they're not a permanent resident here and we honor whatever they have on file with the military, whatever state they're from, they can still get the in-state tuition as long as they're stationed here. So we've had, students graduate high school, the parent gets transferred and wanting to stay on, say, but I've been living in North Carolina. Yeah, but it was your secondary home. We also have a lot of students that, and this is again, probably more for the UNCs, but typically, the family has a secondary home here, the beach. Statutes assume that a student is going to be domiciled with their parent or court-appointed legal guardian unless they can prove independence, including financial.
Gene.
That's, yes.
Just to make sure we didn't forget anything, you froze up for about 5 seconds.
Oh, I did?
Yes.
Sorry.
Right after you said to be, and that was it. And then you came back.
Okay, sorry. So they have to be domiciled here. So in this case, the law presumes that the student, unless they can prove they're independent, that they're going to be domiciled wherever their parent is. Now, an interesting twist to this, where we're having a lot of disconnect and problem with high school counselors, is the student doesn't have to be living with them. Okay, as long as that parent or guardian is in North Carolina. For example, we've had cases where the parent
Is it me or is he gone again?
Gene, you muted yourself.
He's gone.
Yeah, let me see if I can fix that.
Hello, now?
Okay, you're back now.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I got muted. So
You muted, someone muted everyone. I don't know who did.
Okay, yeah, not me, sorry. Okay, so
Your presentation is not showing again, so, well, it's small at least.
well, let me keep talking. Let's see if it comes back.
Okay, yes, sir.
It's up.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. So the big disconnect here we have with high school counselors, and I just did a big presentation for like 300 of them yesterday, is by their definition, they're looking to see who the student's living with and they're the same roof. And if the parent is not under the same roof, they consider them homeless in McKinney-Vento. By RDS standards, the residency law, they don't have to be physically under the same roof. We just need to know the parent or legal guardian is here. Okay. To establish permanent residence, the person has to have legal capacity. So I had one today that I was talking to the college about. The student 17 says she doesn't have contact with a parent, but we've got to find another way to qualify her, because legally until she's 18, she can't begin to establish. Likewise, they have to be a U.S. citizen and hold an eligible immigration status. There are exceptions, but I'm talking about what the general law requires first. Okay. So there's several provisions written into the general law before we even get to a campus exception. RDS has built these into the interview. Are they a ward of the state, that is in foster care? Are they emancipated by marriage or court order? Are they orphan? Is there a split family situation? Have they been living long-term with an adult relative in North Carolina? Have they married a North Carolina resident recently? Military families. There's a lot of these special things carved into the general law. RDS screens for all of that. So that's why for some students, they're through the process very quickly. Others, if it's running into problems thinking they'll qualify, will keep asking all these questions and try to qualify them for any special provision that's out there. There are also some campus-based exceptions, and that's going to be, a lot of where we're going to spend the next session next week of how to handle campus-based exceptions. There are a couple that are universal for UNCs, for community colleges. One is veterans and their families receiving a benefit. I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. Eligible full-time employees of UNC system, they can use that on a campus, on a community college campus as well, and a statutory grace period. So if you admitted a student as in-state, the student and their family move away, and let's say they want to keep attending distance learning, or somewhat otherwise loses eligibility, like immigration status expires, they can be permitted 12 months of a grace period to keep attending the same institution from the date of the change. And again, we'll get into all that on campus exceptions, but there are a lot of exceptions here to try to help students like that in transition. Likewise, another campus responsibility is certain categories have tuition waivers, like if you have a senior auditing a course. That kind of thing we'll get into later, but there's a lot of exceptions built in, so we'll probably have to deal with those separately. But these are ones that are kind of universal. And I'll come back to the veterans in particular because we get a lot of questions about that. There are also ones carved into law specific to the North Carolina Community College system, and there was one just signed into law recently, the last one. I'm just going to give you a quick, because again, this could take an entire session just on this about what are the requirements, how do you track it, how long are they eligible, that kind of thing. Business sponsor students where you have a business sending someone for training and they're paying the bill, the entire bill directly. Business, and I put in parentheses, military transfer families. There's a provision under the active duty military that the family would be eligible for that out-in determination. They're probably better off doing that so you don't have to track them, because on campus-based exceptions, you have to track them and collect paperwork because you are making a change. Any of these exceptions don't change RDS's determination. What they do is they allow you to override the tuition rate. There's a provision for in-state tuition. Okay. Sponsored by nonprofit. I want to say a couple comments about this next one because I'm getting a lot of questions about the high school graduates. Okay. Both this one about certain non-citizen and the certain U.S. citizen, neither one of them are a blanket. If you graduated high school, RDS is going to put you in no matter what. We're getting a lot of calls about that, about this student wasn't flagged and they graduated high school. And okay, no, they have additional criteria that they have to meet that the campus has to look at. For example, this one about certain non-U.S. citizen public high school graduates. It's if and only if they had a lawful admission status at some point in the past. So where this would help is a student comes here on a visa, their visa expires, they're still present, but they do not have a current immigration status. And they graduated in North Carolina Public High School. So just in a nutshell, I'm not going through all the requirements, but so it's all of these are very specific. And the reason they're campus-based is there's all these requirements. And sometime, for example, like the veterans, it's tied to a benefit. When the benefit's gone, that exception's gone. So there's no way for RDS to know that. So these all are there is no generic at this point high school, like if you graduating high school, you're going to get II and N from RDS no matter what. There are additional criteria, okay? RDS will flag it with that exception if they're not otherwise meeting criteria to tell us they can, and they've indicated, the high school graduation, it will flag that as informational to you. But for any of these exceptions, it means they couldn't meet the general legal requirements. So they're going to be the equivalent of like we do for active duty military out in once you waive them if they meet the eligibility for the tuition waiver. Okay. Hope that's kind of clear. So yeah, we're getting a lot of calls about, well, I have high school graduates and it's not putting them in. Yeah, it's not automatic in either one of these. Refugees refugee status is eligible for RDS. What this would help is someone who's a new arrival, who hasn't been here, the statutory requirement of 1 year that everyone has to meet. So there would be a provision for that. Non-citizen seeking immigrant status. This is another one with a lot of confusion, and immigration, unfortunately, is very complicated. What this means is this doesn't mean anybody coming to the US. It means someone who has applied for a green card, a permanent resident. Okay, immigration divides things into immigrants and non-immigrants. All your visas are non-immigrants, for example. It's not permanent. So RDS will approve someone who has applied for it and it's been approved, the paperwork, and they don't have their card yet. This is someone who's applied for it. It's under review, but it hasn't been approved yet, that you can give a temporary exception based on that. And again, the guidebook's going to go in, or the guide is going to go to what paperwork you need or how to look for that and suggested forms. So it's not anyone seeking a status from US immigration. So the person applying for asylum, it wouldn't, apply to them. Okay. There's a provision there for federal law enforcement officers coming for training. And this other one, more recent, I'll come back to a little later when we talk about the changes, is parallel, if you will, to that earlier one of non-citizen public high school graduates. It's US citizen. They're not able to pass the criteria. Under certain circumstances, you can give them a waiver for 1 year, an exemption for 1 year. And the idea is they should be hopefully meeting the requirements. Okay. So these are campus-based exceptions specific to the community college system. So those would be managed at your end. The campus responsibility guide goes through what you need to look for, what you need to collect. Okay. So just some general tips. A student generally is not going to qualify until they're 19, because if the parents are truly not here, they're in another state, the student is just turning 18 today, they're not going to be eligible today. They've got to meet that 1 year. And to meet that 1 year requirement, they're going to have the legal capacity to start. There are some exceptions. For example, the orphans, the marriage, the whatever, but in general. Okay. Again, they don't have to be living with them. That's very different. And I keep trying to tell the high school counselors, because they're telling them, oh, don't put the parent down because you're not living with them. No, please put the parent down. We just want to see at least one parent is living in North Carolina. I know some of this sounds a little cumbersome for the students you're primarily serving, but keep in mind we also serve like all the UNCs, and probably 15 or more % of the applications we get are students who live in another state who want to come here to go to school. So some of these questions are important in those circumstances. So yes, put down the parent information. A lot of the special scenarios, as I talked about earlier, RDS, the interview will accommodate them. Let them try that. And if all else fails, we'll talk about how to come back or do an appeal or whatever necessary. At the end of the day, I'll tell you that for the population that's your primary population, at the end of the day, most of them should be getting in state. I'll tell you where the problems are, and it's from our perspective, a lot of times the students are rushing through or give wrong information. Yeah, and I keep emphasizing this to the high school counselors. If the student doesn't have the information in front of them, have them say where they are. You can always pick up and come back. A lot of them just skip over everything or just put something, make up something and put it in. It's not going to validate. And then everyone gets upset and they're like, well, I'm really living here. And, we have to take at face value. If you say no to every question, my parents and I, no one has a driver's license, ID, vehicle registration, registered to vote, not working, didn't pay taxes, don't have Medicaid, food stamps, or any health program, and so forth. If you say no to everything, we take that at face value, like, well, maybe the person just moved here. This is a frequent issue we see. So what are the top reasons they get out of state on their first submission? The number one overwhelmingly is they type in wrong information, social or date of birth from themselves or if necessary a parent. They're asked to type it in twice to make sure they're not, miskeying something in, and this is a huge issue. We're trying our best to, find ways to minimize it. The second, as I mentioned earlier, is not answering enough questions or saying no to most items. This is especially true with our high school students, I think, during college app season. I think they're in a hurry or whatever, or they just key a number in. The system, by the way, if you're not familiar with it, is designed to try to handle almost everything electronically and not collect documents. There's very few cases we need documents anymore. We've gradually turned them off. There's some things we can't do without, such as immigration or military service here. But most things have been essentially turned off, and then we verify electronically. They're trying to say they're independent from their parents in another state, but don't give any information. They get a warning. An appeal. The reason they didn't, or the reason they don't tell us, for example, about their own employment, is they think this is tied to financial aid, and depending on how they answer, it might change the amount of financial aid they qualify for. That's not the purpose of this. We're looking to see if they meet the legal requirements. Not meeting the 12-month period living here. As I say, there's some exceptions, not many to that. Failing to turn in documents, that's become less frequent, but they have time to do it if they don't. A special complex situation, not as often as you think. If I looked at like all the students coming back in a reconsideration and appeal, I would say easily 70-75% were either they keyed in something wrong or they skipped almost all the questions. So those are the most common things we're seeing at our end. So if you have a student there and they're working, please encourage them to take it very seriously, and if they don't have the information, come back. I'm often asked, RDS requires all kinds of stuff no one else does. This is available on our website for counselors and students, to see what we require versus FAFSA, what type of information. So it's pretty similar. The online systems we talked about is, the first come through the initial consideration. They get in the initial consideration only a provisional determination. That was basically to accommodate, your last minute students, where even before it's been validated, it typically takes a day or so, sometimes 2 days, depending on if there's a holiday, to get back the electronic validation from agencies. So what happens is if they say, yeah, we have a driver's license, yes, we pay taxes, it simply pings those agencies to say, here's the person, can you verify that? And we don't get a lot of detail, basically yes or no or the dates, involved. So the interview has skip logic, as I say, it asks certain questions, and depending how you answered it, bypasses certain modules or takes you into them. If you're a US citizen, it's obviously not going to take you into the immigration modules and so forth. They get their RCN number, they have to give it to the college university. When RDS makes a determination, it is immediately available on the server to be pulled in and goes to the state grad system. Okay. What happens if they think it's incorrect? They can submit a reconsideration or appeal, the first two things, and the system will walk them through and explain the difference. A lot of students say, I'll just go to an appeal, it sounds better. In some cases, it actually slows them down. So if they said no to everything, and didn't answer the questions correctly or just skipped over them, they're better off coming back into reconsideration, because then it tries to validate everything electronically. It tells them on the appeal is if your situation's so unique or you don't have anything else to provide, but you think there's special circumstances to explain. They just fill out basically a short form and it comes in. So it doesn't go to state agencies. And at that point, RDS has to ask for a bunch of documents because they bypass that. So the system tries to walk them through which is the better choice in the two. If all that fails, they still get out of state. You can look at eligibility for a campus-based exception. Depending on their scenario, if they indicated to RDS that they may be eligible for one of them, it flags it with one of those codes. So for example, if they say, yes, I'm a veteran, I just moved here a month ago, I don't qualify, but I'm a veteran, I have a benefit, it flags it. So you get a category code that goes into your system that it's informational. Same thing with some of the other exceptions, the high school exception or whatever, it's going to give you an informational flag based if the student tells us. If the student doesn't tell us, that doesn't mean you can't do the exception. It's just if they tell us, we pass it on. For example, sometimes students at UNCs will say, oh, I'm a UNC employee. Well, they're not a full-time employee. They might be on work study for 10 hours a week. But if they put it down, we flag it and let their HR, review it to see if they're eligible. If all else fails, there is a level 2 appeal that comes to SEAA. It's administrative review, and at that point, the student is submitting new information. Under the old system, it would have been a state residency committee. Honestly, we get very few of these. We had 17 in the last fiscal year, and I think it was like 15 of them were all students attending a 4-year, trying to, after a year, get it state tuition. So, I mean, we don't get a lot of these, or I disagree. We didn't have any this year, but in the past years we had people disagreeing, for example, saying, I don't think it's fair that, as a DACA student, I can't get in state tuition. So whenever the student logs back in, they have a dashboard and they can see in their account where they stand. It tells you, are you resident of this? Has this been validated? If they owe documents, there's a big red flag and it tells them what they owe and what the deadline is. And on here, it gives them the option if they disagree and want to do a reconsideration appeal, and then it will walk them through the difference. But a lot of times students will say, well, I don't know what the status is or what. They can always log in and see this at any time. In terms of calls from campuses, these are the most frequent things we hear from y'all. Can you help us with status? A lot of times it may be a student, especially, start a term, they didn't pass and it's the 11th hour and they have a reconsideration in, can you tell us the status? Student wanting to know why they got non-resident. And by the way, the student could call the call center at any time and they will walk them through that as well as the next steps. A lot of times they'll say, well, I didn't know and I didn't know what to do. It's on, the phone number is on almost every page of the application. Next is campus having a problem pulling a determination. Hint here, I hear this a lot still. Someone says, I ran XRDO and it keeps saying that there's a determination pending. Those messages are not from RDS. That's an issue in your colleague system, and there's a campus manual to troubleshoot. At a wish list to put on there, contact your IT administrator. They think it's pending on the RDS side, saying it's been pending for 2 weeks. It's stuck in the colleague system. So, but there's a determination guide. We'll look at this later where that resource is, and you can go through of how to clear those errors. Effective date, history. So these are the typical calls that we get from campuses. I want to talk about 2 issues very quickly in terms of clarifying some common questions we get. And we get a lot of questions about immigration and about military and veterans. Immigration, there are 2 types of status that would be eligible. Is it permanent or is it temporary? The campus does not, RDS is going to collect all this documentation up front. The only time the campus is required to collect any of that would be if they have an expiring category, if it's not permanent. So your green card holders are permanent. Any indefinite status, so immigration considers your permanent residents, asylees and refugees as having an indefinite status. There is no expiration date. We have access to a different database than colleges use because you all just have like the F1 visa reporting. And we look all that up, and that's what they say. It's students with a visa or temporary protected status get flagged with the flag. This is non-resident alien, and we will give you a tracking date. So if the student stays enrolled long-term, those are the only ones you need to track. And again, we'll come back to this in the next session, which ones and how to look at that. And at that point, you could either send them back to RDS for a new determination, see if the visa's been renewed. You could collect the document yourself, or if they tell you it hasn't been renewed, you might put them on a grace period for 1 year. Okay. People commonly use the phrase undocumented. We avoid that in our interview because honestly, I haven't seen many undocumented students come through the system. DACA is not an undocumented student. Someone applying for asylum is not undocumented if they have something in their hand from immigration. They have a work permit and so forth. It's just that they don't hold an immigration status while their application's pending. So it is also possible people can have, and we see this sometimes, a valid visa. They are here, they're on a visa, they have a non-immigrant visa, but it's not eligible. Classic one would be F1, that's student visa, because the requirement is that they're only here temporarily, have to leave so many days after classes end, and they're maintaining a residence somewhere else. Someone, for example, on a tourist visa, they're here to visit family. That they're documented, they have a legal visa, but it's not eligible by its definition and conditions to have an eligible status. Okay, but the student must currently hold an eligible status and have held it for 12 months to be able to establish domicile. There are a couple of exceptions to this. And for example, in all those community college exceptions, I believe Monty, or I don't know if Jado was in the line, but I think the only one that really would apply to DACA might be the business sponsored. If a business is sending someone for training, okay, then immigration status is not an issue because you're overriding for the business, as long as each semester that's the situation. The other exception for that, or someone who doesn't have a documented eligible status, would be the active duty military exception. There are members of the military who do not hold an eligible immigration status. The military will take them. And likewise, their family members. And there are programs to try to help them apply for a status. So if they have that out-in determination, that's why we give the out-in. They're out in terms of being a resident and meeting the residency requirements, or they're claiming another state, or they don't have duration. They don't have to meet that because all they're getting is a tuition waiver. Where that makes a big difference in the distinction is non-residents are generally not eligible for state grants because of the laws and the funding of the grants. You have to be a resident. So generally, the exceptions don't apply to state grants. That's why if they can meet the regular criteria, it's better than giving an exception because it might help them with the grant. The other thing we get a lot of questions on are veterans exceptions. Like the active duty military, we tell them as they're coming through the interview, if you think you meet the regular residency criteria, like that person who's happens to be active duty military in North Carolina, don't take the military exception, come through the regular path, because then it might put you eligible for state grants and then you don't need tracking. With veterans, same thing. The difference is North Carolina law does not have a blanket exception for veterans and their families like it does for active duty. The active duty, you'll notice, RDS handles because there's no additional requirement. They don't have to use a financial aid benefit. Okay, it's just attached to the military service. Veterans is different. The Veterans Choice Act has certain requirements, and they must have an award and use the award to get the waiver. We've had some colleges think that, oh, as long as they say they were in the armed forces any time in the past, that's all it takes. No, that person has to have and be awarded a benefit to meet the legal requirements of the federal law. So because of that, that has to be handled at the campus level. But If basically, if the VA certifies them, you're good, they're in. If not, they're not eligible. Okay, so now we're going to get to the recent changes. Issue 2 updates the official RDS guidebook. It's on the public website, and the campus residency responsibility guide. The RDS guidebook is the official Bible, if you will, that we use and use in processing and reviewing appeals. It is hyperlinked to all the statutory references and has been updated. I'm going to go through some of the changes. The campus guide goes into what are those functions or those campus exceptions that you're responsible for, and what tracking. Aren't a lot of tracking. There's some, as I say, usually like it's the visa or something like that, that is very time limited. And that goes into those, and we'll come to that. This took us a while to have released. Basically, that RDS guidebook, the others new, but the RDS guidebook was revamped from the previous system when there was a state residency committee. So just tweaked to reflect RDS. And as a result, and some changes and whatnot, they wanted to be a legal review. They did, they blessed it, so we're good. So sorry it took a while. I plan to issue a new one shortly because there's still 2 things in the legislature pending. So we won't have such a gap between them in future. So some of the changes. In the new guidebook, I really reworked the section on immigration issues. Before, to me, it was very confusing about this form and this form, or this form and this form. And it's now categorized by category, as the person saying they're permanent resident, are they an asylee, a refugee, a visa holder, and then underneath it lists the forms and documentation. I've added a few visas that were eligible, and we've deleted some that have been discontinued or no longer valid. After reviewing the ones we discontinued, I only saw one example of one of them one time at a UNC. These are all uncommon, but I went through a comprehensive review of everything to find anything else we could with our consulting immigration attorney in the system. There's a couple of other forms we added as eligible. And again, that's usually something RDS is handling all of that up front, but just FYI. Clarifying that most students, when they turn 18, you can't automatically meet their duration requirements if, as a minor, your parents were not domiciled here. So just turning 18 is not enough. You'd have to have established your own for a year. Most of the other changes involve campus-based exceptions. Veterans Choice Act is referenced in there and in North Carolina law, but basically it's federal law that takes precedence. It used to be until last month, they had to use the exception, had to be granted within 3 years of discharge. They have eliminated that requirement. So if there's a benefit and they award it, in general, anybody that's a veteran, if there's a benefit and they award it, you're good to go. A new provision was signed into law. This has to do with the active duty. So you have an active duty service member who's claiming another state as their permanent residence, but the student gets that out in, eligible for in-state tuition based on the active duty exception. In general, the law says that the student has, that the service member has to be eligible on the student's first day when they first enroll. So if that person gets transferred, they lose eligibility. However, once they're enrolled, they can stay enrolled at the same program, even if the service member is gone, as long as they finish that same program at the same institution. Governor signed into law in February a new provision that if a high school senior has a letter of admission, got that out in from RDS, that if the service member gets transferred before they start college, they can keep the out in where they normally would have lost it, but they must enroll by the fall semester following their high school graduation. So there is a little window there. Providing clarification that the UNC full-time employee exception can be used in North Carolina Community College, but you need to use the same criteria they do. And this is detailed on the other publication. Basically, their HR has to certify that they're an eligible employee. As I say, it can't be part-time, it can't be work study, it can't be whatever. And where that helps them essentially is for duration. You have a family who, let's say someone takes a position, comes here to be on the faculty at one of the universities, and they just move here in August. they won't meet duration for a year. This is going to help them in that first year. So clarifying on whether high school students or dually enrolled need to come through, and I'm going to come back to this in a bit, but we've made another change. So as you know, within the community college system, your CCP students, if they're enrolling as part of CCP, are not required to come through RDS. They will be once they graduate and become a full-time, college student. Added language to the National Student Clearinghouse data is used. So what RDS is doing now, and this helps especially for your students who maybe are visiting over a summer term or another term just to take one class, that rather than the determinations expiring, it's going to keep extending if they're enrolled anywhere. However, any exceptions, it won't, like the active duty out-in or a time-limited visa, it's not going to automatically extend them because we have to see eligible. This is the one we talked about. The one recently signed a law is that for U.S. citizen recent high school graduates, there's some provisions in there about giving them up to a 1 year of exception. And that I was just referencing this about we're going to add to have exempt students in the apprenticeship NC program not having to complete RDS part of their high school graduation, so similar to CCP. So in those cases, there will be some new codes coming for you to use in college. If, for example, this high school exception is going to be different from the ones for non-citizens, so there'll be a new code coming. And that they haven't been signed to law, but they're in the appropriations bill and in both versions of it, so I think there's a good chance it will pass. Currently, the UNC only has 2 exceptions when you all have a bunch of them there in the community college system, is if you're a full scholarship student or a eligible full-time permanent employee. Full scholarship doesn't happen as often as you think. In fact, we had one today coming through an appeal that, probably has like 3/4 or so, a lot of them. But currently the law says it's any scholarship other than athletic. There's a provision in there to extend it to athletic, but this one, unlike the full-time employee, seems to, under the current version of text, only apply to a UNC campus. There's also a proposed tuition waiver for graduates of the North Carolina North Carolina School of Science. All provisional, but starting with the most recent graduating class. It's not retroactive going back beyond that. So we'll let you know the progress of those. Those are things we monitor. And we'll update the campus manual because those would be, the second one would certainly be one you might come across. So the other publication was the Campus Responsibility Guide. And that one I'm going to really go into more detail in the next session, just focusing on that for folks that's your job to really get into the nitty-gritty of this and coding it banner and who do we track and who's responsible for tracking any time-limited situations. And so that's coming up next week. And we'll go into more detail with that, those who need that. If you're not familiar, a lot of resources out there on our public website that accessible to students. There's a lot of Q&As. There's a lot of helpful handouts on specific topics, helping students, for example, with questions about immigration statuses and so forth. Some of them are translated into Spanish as well for parents. There's an official guidebook, official laws. The phone number for students. This call center is dedicated to them. And during peak season, like last month, we extended the hours. They go till 8 p.m. But those are the standard hours. And they can call with a general question, password reset. I'm not sure how to answer this question. I don't know what the next step is. Should I do a reconsideration appeal? Why did I get out of state? Some of the things that go to you, you could direct them to the call center, and the call center will look that up and help them with that. There's also, as you probably know, a campus support line. Please don't give this to students because we want it to be available for you. So the campus staff there does the processing at RDS, general questions, checking specific determination, clarification, troubleshooting. There's also in the bottom of the public website a password protected link where you can get like this SEA, the campus manual, and some additional policy and procedural information. So we'll send this to you. There's also, of course, on the community college system documentation now of the knowledge base where there's a RDS general guide set up, but there's also a great tool for troubleshooting when you get residency issues in colleague and those error messages and so forth. So if you're not familiar with that, try to go and download those. And then finally, I'm on the SEA side, and my role is to provide the official policy guidance on residency issues, publish the official publications, and probably would be the one to come through with campus-based exceptions and tracking responsibilities. RDS is somewhat familiar, but they serve UNCs that have, you all are on colleague, they've got a mix of Banner and PeopleSoft, and the private universities use this for their grants eligibility. So we got other systems there. So they have some basic knowledge, but not, a lot of detailed knowledge about your system. And that is it. So hopefully we got some questions waiting.
Please feel free to ask any question you like. Michelle Dupree, you have a question?
I do.
Okay.
When in that exception where you talked about a high school senior who has a letter of admission and RDS already gave them the out and in because their active duty member was active at that time or whatever, and then they leave or are no longer active, we're still required to keep documentation. So what kind of documentation do you propose we have? Because we can't get the documentation that we currently get if the active duty member is here or the active duty member is still active.
Okay. Well, first, let me qualify this in saying, from our perspective, you're not required to collect documentation. If the campus chooses to do that, because I hear the same thing about immigration or active duty military, there's no campus exception. RDS has collected that. From our perspective, you only need to do that, and that's where the campus manual should help distinguish between those. If you are granting an exception, so obviously for veterans you would, because they don't meet the criteria, but if we already assign that out in and it doesn't have any other requirements that you're having to review. Now, if your campus chooses to, you can. I mean, there's nothing to preclude that. It's like campuses are saying, well, we've always made copies and green cards and done this and that. There's no requirement from our perspective because it's not a campus-based exception.
Right, but the document says that we have to, the campus is responsible for tracking a member's continued eligibility at regular intervals based on assignment, reassignment, retirement, or honorable discharge. So if we found it easier to just request one document at the beginning to track all of that, or to ensure we have all of that, or are able to track that.
Okay. Well, here's the balance in that, and that might be, I don't know if you're planning to be on next week, because that would be a great campus thing to talk about.
I will
because the guidebook also says that if you're admitted under that out-in, okay, then you're good to go, even if that person leaves, as long as you stay continuously enrolled. So the tracking at that point becomes, are they continuously enrolled?
Okay. Okay. So I'll talk more, I guess, about that, because continuous enrollment comes to question with changing programs. Because I believe if they change programs, they're not continuously enrolled. If they graduate from a program, there's no longer continuous enrollment.
Correct.
We have a lot of students that come to us who are active duty military or were active duty military. When they filled out RDS, they got the exception of out in. They are no longer active duty military when they start with us.
Okay. Well, again, I'm going to say from our perspective, the student technically has the responsibility to notify us. Like, it's the same thing if leave military off the table for a minute. Let's say their parents are here and the parents move in the meantime. Student's supposed to notify us. If they don't, they don't. I don't think there's liability on the college's part, because I mean, we're screening up front. And that's one of the reasons there's a time limited thing here. It's if you become aware of it, that's another issue. But I think it's a campus choice. I mean, right now there's not a requirement up front. But yes, I mean, we can define that. But yes, once they graduate or change programs, that's a different story, or stop out.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions? I do not see anything in the chat box right now. Hold on, I think I see one now. Katie Catul said, hey, Katie. Kathy, I just wanted to say how helpful the call center is to students and parents. I really encourage our students to call during the RDS process, or if they don't understand why they have been coded as an out-of-state resident. All the staff I have interacted with have been excellent. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kathy. Likewise, it's always good to work with you.
Gene, we mentioned the apprenticeships. Did we mention that?
Yes.
Okay.
I did. And it was on a slide that it's new.
It was. I remember.
The code will be forthcoming. Let me just mention that, like, for example, and this is not unusual, like in the last 3 months, I've had, I think, 3 different campuses contact me saying, oh, this student, you know, like their parent died or something, and, you know, how come they're getting out of state? Well, in each of the cases, for example, you know, and I actually set screenshots, the student's telling us something different. So, you know, yes, we're happy to, it's, you know, when the student says, yes, my parents are living there in North Carolina, or no, they're not, I mean, we're taking that at face value. And if a student comes through 4 times, it says the same thing. In another case, they were saying, you know, they didn't have any relative here in North Carolina, and then came through like 3 times with different parent names every time. So, I mean, if the student really is, part of it is sometimes we're trying to figure out what is the situation. And in each of these cases, the student was contacted on appeal and never responded. So to emails and phone calls, they do both. So, I mean, sometimes it's, you know, please know that, or I really think the staff is trying their best to find any way to qualify a person, but sometimes, you know, we're getting a big mismatch of information here. And in one of the cases where they said, you know, the mother wasn't in the picture, I mean, we got a letter from the mother, so, yeah. But questions or concerns or general feedback would be helpful. We're you know, happy to take that too, or suggestions. I don't know if you've had time to look at the new campus manual. I greatly expanded it to try to put more tools in there, like the codes and contact numbers and all of that.
And I think that some of the conversations we've had is we really don't want the institutions to take on more of the documentation collection than they have to. Mm-hmm. Correct, but some of them are doing so. Yeah.
And there's where I hope the new manual will help, the campus guide, and we'll go through that next week. I think from our perspective, a lot of you are choosing to collect stuff that you really don't need to. If you're going to choose to do it, I mean, you can, but you know, a part of this with RDS was having that electronically and or that we're scanning the documents in. So it's really only if you're dealing with an exception that if that student gets out of state, out, and you're having to document why you're giving them in-state tuition, at that point, yeah, you need to collect documents. Other than that, I mean, it's very limited. As I say, for example, if a student has a visa that expires next month, you're going to get that flagged with a date. You could either send the student back, you could collect it, but if you do, you've got to note if they're continuously enrolled and, you know, handle it at the campus level. But these are not super common scenarios. But, you know, there's no need to copy things like a driver's license or an immigration green card or anything like that.
Okay. Are there any additional questions?
So was this overwhelming? Hopefully
Yeah, I
not.
think I got one comment. Hold on. That's from Gretchen. Hold on, I can't read it yet. We've seen a few times where the students has a parent slash guardian, but then lives with. I'm sorry, but then lives with. Okay, but then lives with and is supported by the grandparent. I'm sorry, let me read it all over again. We've seen a few times where the student has a guardian or parent, but then lives with and is supported by the someone else, such as the grandparent. We are being advised they use the information of the person that has legal guardianship. Is that best, even if this isn't who is financially supporting the student?
Okay, so I think it goes back to the first statement about parent or legal guardian. If if there's a parent in North Carolina, they do not have to be living with them. If we could have any information to look them up, I mean, we've for example, for some kids who don't have like a lot of contact, there was name in the school transcript of the parent as well as who they were staying with, the adult they were with. And we were able to do some lookup in databases we have to find that the parent is still in North Carolina, they're done. So the law is going to default to the parent. If you're saying there's a legal guardian, okay, then yes, you can use the legal guardian, but it's got to be a court-appointed legal guardian. A lot of times we get a parent signing a power of attorney, and they do that a lot when they're in the other state and trying to, find a way to get them in state. That's not a court-appointed legal guardian. So who legally, has been responsible for the individual? So if it's not the parent, it's at that point, it's not about the money of who's supporting, it's whose domicile. I mean, everybody can be unemployed. That's not going to make a difference. It's who legally has the control of that minor.
So it has to be court appointed.
Yes.
Okay.
That's very clear in the guidebook. And
the
it
reason I ask,
says,
we have kids who live with their grandparents their whole lives, and
okay,
they're
yeah,
not court appointed, but the parents are nowhere around, never have been, ever.
That's different, okay? Because then you have a 5-year exception where it just says if they've lived with uninterrupted, one or more, it could be a series of people that are adult relatives. Okay, but the person who just has been here for a year saying,
okay,
we get that, and it's a power of attorney, that doesn't work. But yeah, if they've lived long-term with an adult relative, yes, that's who we can use. It might end up having to come in an appeal depending on the scenario. But if they explain, I have lived with my grandmother for 5 years, that's easy to do.
But that will be handled on the RDS side.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that is not a campus exception, any of that. Y'all don't need to worry about that. I mean, RDS would puzzle out with them, are there exceptions here? In general, I would say you don't want to, those exceptions are very helpful, and certainly you want to use them to help students that are eligible, not otherwise. But if there's another way to qualify, you don't want to overtax yourselves with all these exceptions you have to track and document. Plus, it limits, if you're evoking an exception at the campus level, it precludes them from getting a state grant. So it's better, if possible, to have or after a year, send them back to RDS and see if they can requalify. Then, reverting as a first step to the campus exception. Does that help, Gretchen?
Okay, Jeremy asks, don't we need the green card for enrollment purposes, that was opposed to tuition determination?
Unless your campus has a policy, or you're aware of any, Monty, at the system office, no. I mean, I don't see why you would, but I mean, do you all have a policy of that?
Not as it relates to RDS or anything as far as tuition, but I can get more information from Jeremy.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't see why. I mean, because for someone who doesn't have a status and they're saying, I want to attend, I'm just not claiming in-state status, how would you treat them? I mean, you know, why would you ask for one? I mean, do you do the same thing for US citizens? Show me you're a US citizen. I don't think for admission purposes there's any, but I'll defer on that, Monty, unless y'all come up with something. But
and that's some
RDS,
information on.
Yeah, from RDS, no. You know, if it's something that RDS certifies, it's only if you have a campus exception or something that we tell you need to track, like the time-limited visas. And the reason for those is, honestly, a lot of them don't get renewed long-term.
Okay, Scott has a question.
Yep.
Doc ID and OPUSE, Opus, I guess, number, let me see. Okay, can released inmates use their Doc ID and Opus number information for the question on the survey related to having a state issued ID? They often no longer have a DMV issued driver's license or ID. It seems like they have a hard time getting determined as in state, even though I can see their incarceration record clearly on the doc offender search.
Okay, so again, I mean, I think, I guess from my perspective, y'all are digging too deep. I mean, you can do that, but I mean, RDS, they're going to have to come back to RDS, is have them explain. I know sometimes the student won't tell us. And then by all practical purposes, if they fill out something saying, I don't have this, we have to take it face value. We don't know. Sometimes if we think they disappeared for a while, maybe that's the case. We might think to look them up and appeal. But if all else fails or something like that, have them come to an appeal. And if they tell us what the story is, I mean, that's easy. Yes, we get in the system, we look and we say, okay, they were incarcerated. I see they've been released. Okay. And we just, you know, the way we handle those was the student a resident at the time they became incarcerated, and have they stayed here since then? If you're talking about they were released 3 years ago, you know, then we want some evidence that they've been here at least a year. So, I mean, we usually piece something together quite easily if we know what to look. Does that help?
So can the school, can the college then intervene on the student's behalf to RDS to say this student has this? Because again, like you said, some students won't release that information. They're kind of concerned about telling people they were incarcerated. So could the school stance be they're going to intercede on the student's behalf, maybe contact RDS and have a conversation with the student and RDS there?
Well, yes, you can do that. I mean, what RDS really couldn't do is, let's say the determination's been made and the student didn't want to share that, is, you know, if you start sharing stuff without the student's consent, then that's going to be problematic. But we also can't go back and change the record of how they answered the questions. So at some point, the student's going to have to come back. I would say you need to encourage them and, you know, something like that, especially for any student that's come through a couple times and they really have been trying, they've been giving some information, they're not just skipping everything, have them go to an appeal, but have them explain what the situation is. They're assigned a worker one-on-one who will work with them, and they can always call and ask to speak to that person and explain that. But yes, but I mean, once it's done, it's kind of done. They're going to have to come back anyway. But I don't see why you couldn't pull that RDS worker on the phone if you want to have, you know, the three of you on the phone. That's fine.
Yeah, because I don't think collecting documentation from the student will help anything on the school side.
No, because
it won't change anything.
You know, yeah, it's not going to change the determination, and we can't, you know, change the student's answers in the system. So the student's going to have to come back through, and maybe helping them to understand that, you know, this is an issue. You know, RDS has done almost 1.8 million determinations, and we're almost to 1.5 million unique students since we went live. So we've heard it all, trust me, or pretty much everything. So, I mean, this is not uncommon. And I think we really try to help those students if we know what the situation is. Like some of these that came through where they give 3 different sets of parents. Every time they come through, they give different parent. If we know what's going on, we can help them and, counsel them through that or figure it out. But they've got to help us to give us a clue of what's happening, other than I just don't have any IDs. I don't have anything.
Okay. Do we have any other scenarios that Gene could probably help us with? Judy says we have a student with a B1 visa that has a residency status of out and in. I thought a B1 visa was prohibited from attending school.
Okay. So if you want to send me the information, I'll look at it. Something doesn't sound quite right unless they're also a military affiliation. Okay. The visas that are not eligible does not mean they cannot attend college. And that's what I'm hearing for some of you. I guess locally, if you have that admissions policy, you can do that. But from a residency perspective, the student, if they don't have eligibility for in-state tuition, that doesn't preclude them from attending. So that's issue 1. If it was B as in boy, that's somebody here on business or tourist purposes. No, it wouldn't be eligible to establish a permanent residence. But from our perspective, and residency law doesn't preclude them from attending. It just says they wouldn't be eligible for in-state. Now, because you said that OI, I want to make sure that wasn't a mistake. But if there's military involvement, the exception that the military carved into law in North Carolina doesn't require that they have any kind of status. You can have someone who truly has no status and they're still eligible. So if you want to, these are the kinds of ones where I know you get like one of these once in a while and it drives you crazy. It does all of us. But if you want to contact me, I'll happily look into that, because to make sure it wasn't an error. But it's possible, yes, but there's nothing. Residency in terms of tuition purposes doesn't preclude them from attending.
And I think that's part of the issue we're running into with these questions. Is that we're confusing admissions requirements with tuition requirements. And so I think we probably need to have a session of some kind on admissions and visas requirements.
Yeah,
So,
because I'm
assuming,
I mean, other than your F, J, and M visas, those are required to be tracked by immigration, your full-time students or exchange scholars. Other than that, where they're attending or if they're attending or whatnot it's not monitored by immigration. They don't care. So, I mean, Monty, I'm assuming there's no system requirement that they have to have a certain visa to attend classes, right?
Yeah, and well, I will say this, I won't answer that, but I won't let you be responsible for answering that either. So, again, I think that's something that we need to probably, as a group, as an admissions and registrars, staff need to get together and probably have a session on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are different understandings.
Yes.
I always understood.
Yes.
That
Because one is tuition and one, and I don't want you to be responsible for
the difference is tuition.
Yeah.
It's kind of like your DACA students, that doesn't mean they can't attend.
Right.
They don't even have a visa. So, I mean, in some ways, these students are, better positioned in some respect. Yeah.
Yeah. Almira, did you have a question?
Monty, this is Judy. Can I ask another question?
Oh, please do.
Okay, I contacted it's on the same subject. I just want to be clear because I don't want the student not to be able to attend if she's able to attend. I contacted our field representative from SEVIS to ask her about this student, and she said that she had to change her status to be able to attend. And because right now she's a visiting, she has on a B1 visa, which is a visitor. So okay. I just want to make sure I'm telling the student right. If she can attend, then that's fine. But I was told she couldn't attend.
So JW, I guess I will kick all that to you. CVIS only deals with F, J, and M visas, period.
Yes.
So the student is not on an F1. The question becomes, you know, are you all going to take them? I mean, the same thing with DACA. I mean, they don't have a visa. So, I mean, I think that's a system-wide policy to look at for admission. From residency to law in terms of tuition, I see nothing to preclude any of those students from attending. It's just they wouldn't get in-state tuition.
And so what would preclude that would be state board code, Gene. So there are some regulations with that. And Judy, we need to research that on the B1 visas. I remember when I started at Fayetteville, and then right after 9/11, there was a numbered memo that came out that said visitor visas, the B1 visas, would not be able to attend college. And I don't know if that still stands. So we need to get with general counsel to see if that still stands. And then you are correct, Gene. The F1 and the J visas, you have to be with CVIS in order to provide the appropriate documentations for those students to attend. And that's federally regulated, as you know. And then with undocumented students, there is some distinction on who can attend and who cannot attend. And that's based on their high school graduation, and that's in state board code as well. So we'll get with Mondi and Tawanda, and we'll come up with a professional development that's separate in the decision-making process for admissions, because that decision-making process is completely different than the residency decision.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Great questions. Are there any more questions? All right, I don't see anything coming up, and I don't see any hands raised, and no one is speaking, so I will assume that everyone is satisfied with the information they received today. Well, I won't say satisfied, but hey, it's good information, Gene. Great. Thank you for presenting for us today with this information. I'm sure you're gonna get a lot more questions afterwards. And just so everyone knows, we're gonna have a follow-up session to this next week on the 22nd. And I've already sent the invite out to everyone, and that is going to be with the updates to the guide, right, Gene?
Yes, that's correct. We're going to look at the guide and then the campus responsibilities.
Okay.
How to process the determinations and the anything you have to track, which is just a couple things, but yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gene. And thank you everyone for being on this call. It is being recorded. I'm going to stop the recording right now. It's being stopped in case you have something